Welcome back. This is Julian Assange broadcasting from the Ecuadorian Embassy. On the night of the EU independence referendum, the vote is currently being counted. We're live streaming on brexitclub.eu. You can communicate to us on Twitter with #AskBrexitClub. We're in our final round because everyone's getting tired and the crew wants to go home. We have a new guest to keep our spirits high. EmbassyCat, twitter.com/EmbassyCat. Interestingly, the UK started a rival cat, very, very strange thing. Nice cat, unfortunately named after Lord Palmerston, the guy who invented gunboat diplomacy and launched the Opium Wars against China, massacred people in Cairo, cracked down on the Irish, and so on. His successor called his reign as Foreign Minister of the UK and as Prime Minister as one long crime. With me we have Naomi Colvin, Director of Courage for the UK. Oh, that hurts. Craig Murray, former ambassador and a Scotsman. Srečko Horvat, philosopher from Croatia and the DM25 movement to reconstruct Europe, and EmbassyCat. I'm Julian Assange. The latest update which has been reported from the BBC site, so no need to watch the BBC because we have everything here. The Leave count, 2,466,071. Remain, 2.5 million and 30,175. So 2.46 million for Leave, 2.53 million for Remain. It's still quite early in terms of the count. It's been going up and down quite a lot about who's ahead based upon which particular regions are counted first. So it's quite hard to say. But I think regardless of what the outcome is tomorrow, it's clear that it's going to be very close. And this is a referendum on the political legitimacy of Europe and to a degree the political legitimacy of the establishment here within the United Kingdom. And a close result means a statement by the population of this country that Europe and the European establishment and the British establishment lack political legitimacy, and so that means perhaps a will to change Europe, not just from the UK, but those signals are going to be reverberating through the rest of Europe. So we want to finish our discussion with what is the future of Europe. We don't need really to consider precisely which side makes it in the UK referendum, but the shockwave will go out nonetheless, that there's only been a just win or a just lose. Perhaps we'll start with you, Naomi.
Sure, okay, well, yes, just with a small question, right? What's the future of Europe? I think that, from what we've discussed here, it's very clear that there's a crisis of legitimacy in Europe. There's a crisis in numerous European countries on a domestic level, which has unfortunately translated more often than not into sort of nationalist or sort of right-wing ascendancies. I would love to think that a better Europe is possible, but in order for that to happen, we're well beyond time, beyond time of of organising for that properly. And I've said before that the failure to make a positive case on the Remain side in this referendum was horrendous.
Yeah,
I think it's a real
only a negative case.
Only a negative case, and those of us who want to build a better Europe have to really start making that case and make it on a national level and force it onto a national level, just as in the UK the Leave vote has been astonishingly successful in infiltrating national politics, and we need to actually learn from that example and understand how to do it and get moving because time is short.
Shreko? Let me just interrupt you. The Shadow Defence Secretary, so that's Emily Thornberry from Labour, a Blairite, I think.
No.
No?
Not really.
No, she's more on the left.
Okay, sorry, that was the former one, the former Defence Secretary. Says, I think whatever happens, about half the country has grave reservations. We need to think about why that is, what we don't want to do is not learn lessons from that. Quite awkward statement, double negatives, but okay. She said that while housing and public services are under strain, quote, there are things that we can do, these are all things that are in our power, something about, and David Cameron ought to listen to that. So Labour obviously trying to push this as a referendum in some ways against Cameron's government. Craig, what do you see the future of the debate in Europe and Scotland?
I want to go back to Palmerston to start with.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of interesting things Palmerston did which have a resonance today. Using the Secret Service. In 1831, he smuggled arms to the Polish rebellion against Russian rule. There was a guy called Colin Mackenzie who was in charge of the actual operation. In, I think, 1834, he had an operation smuggling weapons to the Chechen and Dagestani jihadi rebels against Russia on a ship called the Vixen, covered under a load of salt, which the Russians intercepted and discovered. That was led by a chap called David Urquhart, who later became First Secretary of the British Embassy in Constantinople. And it's relevant because it shows...
This is why we have a former ambassador. Actually, you've been writing a book on a famous Scottish diplomat.
I have indeed. And in fact, the two episodes I just mentioned by chance are in my new book, which is coming out which is coming out in August. But
good job.
Thank you. But the fact that the British security services were financing, arming, and funding rebel movements against Russia 200 years ago. Really has a lot of resonance for what's happening in Europe now, because Europe still does have that division. We're in a situation where we've got continued NATO pressure on Russia. You've got the missile systems moving into Eastern Europe. You've got this kind of extraordinary level of propaganda.
Quite confrontational rhetoric.
Exactly, and there was a Russian submarine that passed through the Dover Straits a week ago, perfectly legally. Russian vessels have been doing that perfectly legally. They have every right to do that in international law. And they've been doing it for nearly 200 years.
Chomsky made this point quite recently, about 2 weeks ago, that the stories about confrontations at sea or in the air with military vessels, they're not in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean. They're not off the coast of California. They're with China in the in the South China Sea, with US vessels right in front of China's main gateway to the world, and they're up near Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave near the Baltic states.
And Europe has to...
Dover's a little bit further from Kaliningrad, but it's still in the European area.
It is, and Dover is an international strait, which there is a right of passage through for warships. And
it's not an unusual thing. What is unusual, what is different, I guess, is that the media are choosing to pick that up, and the government is choosing to tell the media.
Exactly, and the photographs which the media were using were taken by the government.
Yeah.
The British military were taking the photographs.
They have a desire to whip this up for some reason.
Yeah, there's a deliberate attempt to raise up tension between Western Europe and Russia at the moment.
Or maybe it's just the Navy trying to get more funding.
They could hardly have less funding, to be fair to them. Well, the problem with the Navy is all
we have a new result, just a minute.
Uh-huh.
Remain on 50.8%, Brexit on 49.2%, with about 4 million votes counted in total. But only 64 of 382 areas. So 4 million votes out of probably 50 million. That would actually be statistically valid. You could predict probably from that. But actually this is counting by area, and the areas have particular tendencies. So it's still hard to, importantly, only a couple of London areas counted. London will go solidly for Remain. Craig?
No.
Dover, photos to British newspapers from the British government.
Yeah. So there's this deliberate stoking up of anti-Russian feeling. And Russia, of course, is a major part of Europe. And Russia is a very important part of European
Well, the Russians think so.
civilization.
I'm not sure the rest of Europe does. It's an interesting question.
No, but, you know, Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky.
That's true. Culturally, those are in the English canon,
Yeah.
taught at schools, and translation, whereas the zoo, for example, is not. There's not the same Chinese literature influence.
No, I mean Russia is part of mainstream European culture, and should be. And how my main interest is not really so much in the internal development of the European Union, which will potter on it. I don't think we see any radical change. The demise of the European Union, or the demise of the euro, or whatever mechanisms we have been predicted, you know, at sort of 5-year cycles throughout my lifetime. But the demise never happens, and I don't think the demise will happen. I'm much more interested in the diplomatic and strategic question of how the Europe that's within the EU relates to the wider Europe that still isn't in the EU.
Yes, I think is very, very important. Alex Salmond, who is the head of the Scottish National Party within the within Commons, within the British Parliament, and former head for a long time of the Scottish National Party within Scotland, has called for David Cameron to resign. Quote, "I don't think how he can survive this." I'm not sure. A close vote, I guess.
Well, I mean, if there's, from what I've been reading over the past couple of days, is there any planning that's been going on? There's been an immense amount of planning within the Conservative Party to make sure that David Cameron stays Prime Minister. There seems to be a lot of work gone into that.
As a poll from Forbes, which is interesting, if you think that the US did its Brexit quite a long time ago, not from Europe, but from the UK, it says 80% of Americans think UK should leave the EU. I wouldn't have guessed that, actually. I thought it would be about 50%.
I thought 80% of Americans didn't know Britain was in the EU.
Yeah, right. Leave that thing whose initials we can't comprehend. It's obviously no good. Get rid of it. Future of Europe.
Let me start by a short story about the future of Europe. So 2 weeks ago, I was invited to an exhibition in Athens, which was the name of the exhibition, the name of the artist, he's called Thomas Belling, and it was one of the best exhibitions I've seen in this year. So it's an exhibition, it's called the Museum of European History in Exile, and you come there at a building of it's the former Ministry of Labour of Greece, which is now being sold to the Superfund, which is now privatizing public assets. So it's a completely empty building, 5 floors. You come in completely alone. The idea is that each visitor comes alone through the 5 levels, and you come from the perspective of 2070, and you look at the history of the European Union. So you enter each room, you see the beginning, the economic cartel, then you see the treaties, then you see the euro, and so on. And the interesting thing was that Yanis Varoufakis and me went together to the exhibition, and we were supposed to go alone, but then at the 3rd floor, we meet each other. And then together we start walking in this completely post-apocalyptic environment, and we meet, and then we come to today's Europe. 2013, 2014, refugee crisis, rise of right-wing extremist parties. We come to a wall, you see on the wall, you see the flag of AfD, Front National, Golden Dawn, Jobbik, and so on. and you see like 30 or 40 flags all around Europe. And then you move on, then you come to 2017, Britain left Europe. Then you come to 2018, Hungary left Europe, walls and so on, and you come to 2020, and Europe doesn't exist anymore. It's a past project. What I want to say, interesting was that Yanis and me met. There was no DM as part of this. What, the cat is making a noise?
She's got something that's
Yeah, I don't know
metallic.
what. Oh, Ketski. And I think this will be the history of the European, and not only the European Union. I mean, if the European Union is going to disintegrate, it means also that Europe as such, as an idea, will also probably collapse. The leaks, which WikiLeaks has published this year, I would just mention 4 of them, show what could be the future of Europe and what is wrong with Europe today. So let's take the TTIP leaks, which reveal a lot about not only secret agreements, but geopolitics as such. Let's take Operation Sophia, which mainstream media didn't report so much about it, but
this was the EU-backed military operation planned to take out the refugee boats in Libya. Multiple phases, several of those phases have occurred. Intercepting them with principally arranged by the British and the Italians, intercepting those boats and then bombing them ashore within Libya and the facilities of the transport agents. Some people call them people smugglers, but what's wrong with the free market? Transport agents facilities in Libya.
Yeah, and I think what these leaks show is that they are using basically the refugee crisis to prepare a new intervention in Libya. So I think, okay.
Well, they are. They did. It's there now.
And it's happening. You have US drones already.
And extensive special forces, including from the United Kingdom, including from France, including from Italy, already there operating in Libya.
So I think this. You know, if Europe will continue with interventionism, not only in Syria, but now again in Libya, I think the refugee crisis cannot be solved. So I think also the refugee crisis, I mean, 1 million people who entered the European Union only during the last year, and now this huge outsourcing of refugees to Turkey and back, this will have a big influence on the future of Europe. Then another leak which you published, and it was very interesting to me because I was following the Greek situation, and as you know, Yanis and me and others all around Europe are trying to build this movement called DM.
This
were
is
the leaks about IMF.
The IMF tapes.
I mean, which is a scandal. It's outrageous what was shown. They are not Badiou, and there's this French philosopher Alain Badiou who talks about the event, but then you see 2 high-ranked officials of the IMF who talk, we have to create a new event in Greece. So what happened last year with the capital controls was an event. It was a shock therapy.
This was to create, the IMF had the view that in order to bully, they didn't use that word, but in order to force the Greeks to accept their austerity demands, essentially, and to a degree Germany as well, they needed to create, or rather they needed to be, a new credit event, Greece going bankrupt,
and they even mentioned Brexit in their conversation.
Yeah, and they even mentioned Brexit, that would have to be, that was planned for this to be just after Brexit, because what's the point in having a coercive credit event if everyone else is too busy to listen to it? So you can't coerce people if European leadership is all obsessed with Brexit. So you have to wait till after Brexit. So that's what they were looking at. Although our publication of that did actually speed up this negotiation process. So the agreement was done before Brexit, not after.
So you don't expect a new event after Brexit?
No, I'm not sure. The deal was done between Tsipras, IMF, and Schäuble, but I haven't been following to see whether, if you like, it's been ratified in all respects. So maybe there's still a bit of a lever there, but it's largely been done. And the structure of that deal was, yes, Greece would get a haircut. Credit, part of its debts would be wiped out, forgotten, but not until after German elections. But in other respects, there's this very harsh regime of 3.5% surplus. That means that Greece must cut services and tax to the degree that it has a 3.5% budget surplus. And that surplus will then go to Germany, essentially, and a bit to the IMF. That will be done. Of course, actually that is impossible. Everyone knows that's impossible. But it seems that Germany hopes it can keep up this fiction. Merkel and company hope that they can keep up this fiction to the German population, especially to German banks and so on, until after the election.
You mentioned German elections. That's what I want to add, because I think the next year will be massively important for the future of Europe. So we have German elections, the rise of AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and you have the French elections and the rise of Front National. And if you know,
just to interrupt you, we now have 50-50 split with exactly with 2.8 million votes on either side, so just over 5 million votes counted. Exactly 50-50 split, 84 areas reporting.
But this is precisely like the future of Europe. It is changing all the time. And now we are, we have two directions. And I think one direction could be France, Front National, Germany, AfD. This is the right-wing direction. The other direction...
interrupt you. I have a clip from Mary Le Pen.
Speaking about her.
Speaking of her. I've been looking for an excuse to play. This is about 4 months ago. She's speaking to the Parliament. I have to say that most of the French presidential candidates have said that I should get asylum in France. On the left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and on the populist left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, populist right, Mary Le Pen just a few weeks ago. So that's something about popular opinion in France. I don't think, frankly, actually, I don't think either of them care that much about my situation. But they're responding to a populist mood in France, which is probably to look a bit tough, to not simply succumb to Americanism. So here she is.
Sound.
Trying.
Enough of the...
For the ENF, the chairwoman, Madame Marine Le Pen.
Mesdames et messieurs les députés,
Thank you, President. Colleagues, the Brits have had enough of the European Union, so they want to get out of the EU. They regret the loss of their sovereignty, the inability to solve problems at a national level. They've got their own way of looking at it, their own culture, the questions of immigration, the economy, or whatever. Mr. Verhofstadt said that we're having a discussion about this, but Mr. Verhofstadt doesn't seem to be particularly interested in what's going on. But I think he must be looking at things through some sort of distorting mirror, because this dwarf European Union, which doesn't show respect for any of the major problems of the world, has no interest in sorting out major...
That was the headline, Mary Le Pen attacking dwarfs with a dwarf European Union.
Conflicts or restoring some balance is simply putting us into a situation where we're humiliated by President Obama, who rings up Mr. Cameron to ask him to stay in the European Union, who actually speaks after the November attacks before the President of the French Republic, who is talking about keeping in this insane policy of receiving migrants. There's a crisis which is getting increasingly serious in the European Union, the crisis of the single currency, which has mutated into a social crisis throughout the European Union, the migratory crisis, millions of people walking towards this Europe without borders, which is open to all, and the European Union is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The negotiations that are opening now is just theatre. I don't think anyone's being taken in by this masquerade that the Brits can improve what's happening in the European Union and stay in. It simply isn't going to happen. That's the situation. Every day we're trying to cobble together some response to the worsening situation. It's all based on blackmail, threats, violations of the rights of people expressed through referendums. It's a sign of the weakness of Europe, and finally we're seeing a step back, and we can be pleased at least about that. You can't keep wasting time infinitely. Finally, this whole thing will be seen for the charade that it is and will collapse completely, and people will get their sovereignty back.
So that's Marine Le Pen. She's the leader of the populist right in France, has about 20% of the vote. But that said, that's considerably more than France's Hollande is polling, and in fact, more than any other prospective French presidential candidate. Elections next year, both in France and in Germany. Shaka?
Yeah, that's, I think, what will decide on the future of Europe, but I wanted to add something for the very end. I mentioned 3 leaks by WikiLeaks.
The interesting thing with Le Pen, you see that it's quite, I think Yanis Varoufakis has told me pretty similar things about the right in Greece. So, yeah, she's basically correct in her criticisms, but then her recommendation about what to do with it, well, it's like ban the immigrants and so on. No, that's the... Yeah.
They don't have a solution as well, I think that's the problem.
Yeah, it doesn't seem, it's a negative solution, just push it all away.
Something new coming?
This is the pound plummeting from yesterday to today. That's quite interesting. It's quite a short plummet, although look, we have a correction back up to here. But it's still much lower than yesterday. So the financial markets believe that the vote has gone more to leave than their initial predictions. But the size is not huge.
Is that an American timeline? Or?
Yeah, that's interesting. Is that an American timeline? Do we know? Because this looks like at about 3 p.m. Okay, we'll find out.
No. They obviously haven't heard my prediction, you see.
Yeah, they haven't heard. They haven't been heard. Bloomberg needs to watch this show, clearly.
Exactly. Can I expand on something you said, which was, Alex Salmond calling on David Cameron to resign?
It could just be political, but the fact is he thinks that Alex is a very consummate politician in this country. Perhaps in some ways, he represents smaller interests, but perhaps in some ways the most consummate politician. He thinks that is going to be picked up. It was picked up. It's not a fantasy to say something like that.
Oh. I'm a major fan of Alex Salmond and have been for years and years and years. But I don't think there's a hope in hell that Cameron will resign.
Yes, they are from Bloomberg, so that is US time.
Oh, it's US time.
So he had to add about 5 hours, presuming it's Eastern Standard Time.
So up to about 8 this evening or something.
Yeah.
No. But I fear that the idea that the Tory party will disintegrate just isn't going to happen. In a week or two's time, in a week's time, they will all be together again, saying it was all just a rough and tumble of politics, and the fact that they were calling each other liars and inciters to murder and racist.
It was a good Eton debate.
Exactly, it's just like the Eton Wall game. You play hard, but then you all friends again.
Well, in a week's time, they'll have Chilcot to talk about, and
That's true. Very important. Chilcot inquiry, July
Yep.
6 or 7.
I think it's the 6th. It's
July
coming.
6. We'll see what's released, but the report itself about 10 million words into the Iraq War.
But what's important for the Tories is power and holding power, and essentially holding power to make sure nobody else can hold it who might do something useful with it. It's holding power in order to maintain a status quo, and particularly in order to maintain the interests of the wealthy. And they will coalesce back around that. They've had tactical disagreements as to whether or not the EU is a useful tool for neoliberalism or not. But it's a tactical disagreement. Their main interest will drive it, and people will be astonished how quickly they're all chummy again.
Yeah, I think that's been quite thoroughly prepared for if they've been doing
Shreko,
anything else during this referendum.
Where do you
doing
think
that.
it's going to go? EU, future EU?
I think there is, to come back, I'm trying to hold my line.
I know, I can see you had a thread.
And
so
I'm
continue.
actually throwing you the ball in your hands, on your terrain.
Oh, so I should answer.
You should answer, but before you answer, we should finish with you, of course, and with your prediction and analysis. But there is something, of course, you are now... I mentioned 3 leaks, TTIP, Operation Sophia, and IMF. But there are other leaks coming, and they were already here, which could also influence the future of Europe, which is Hillary Clinton, right? So maybe you could speak about...
We have a very big publishing year ahead. I'm not going to scoop myself, although I almost did.
Already during the night?
Already. No, not tonight, but previously. Although I pick my words very carefully. People should watch carefully what I say, not assume anything. It's a huge year for WikiLeaks. We will need people to gather around and defend our ability to publish, but yeah, those future publications are historic and will change something of our understanding about how the world works. It'd be an interesting question what influence they have on Europe. I guess countries like France it may increase their... Well, I'm not going to get into it. Actually, I'm treading on very, very dangerous, very dangerous ground.
Future of Europe for you.
Well, as I said, I think Brexit, regardless of which way it occurs, is more a barometer than a driver. But it is an important barometer and diagnosis of the crisis in political legitimacy of Europe and the British establishment. And that's something that's occurring in a number of countries in Europe, and it's been satisfied in some countries like Spain by the rise of the populist left, broadly speaking, and in other countries by the populist right. But it's a real mood of popularism. Whether that ultimately dooms the European project or emancipates it, I think, is a really interesting question. And it goes a bit back to this notion of Craig's about what is Europe versus the EU. And peoples left to their own devices, which share frontiers, share the same landmass, which is what in fact makes the UK an outlier in the equation of continental Europe, are inclined to trade with each other and to integrate in proportion to the speed of transport, the the inverse cost of transport, and in proportion to how much they can communicate and overcome translation barriers. And the cost of transport is decreasing. Translation barriers are decreasing. Communication is incredibly easy. It's all spied upon, of course, but it moves fast. Yeah? That's the trade-off. It's easy communication, but the Yanks get it all. So there is strong, natural, healthy tendencies towards continental European integration. At the same time, there is local emancipation by those same tendencies that we spoke about before. The Welsh are getting more Welsh, the Scottish are getting more Scottish, etc., because they can deal with the world rather than just their local environment, and they have this democratized computational capacity that once only organizations like the State Department and IBM and so on had. And that's perceived as an enormous threat to transatlantic geostrategists. The United States is a natural superpower in the sense that it is one contiguous landmass. It doesn't have massive mountain ranges down the middle, chopping it up like some parts of Europe do. The existing population was essentially wiped out by people who speak English and displaced, so one language also. And that created a United States, which eventually led to one currency and one political union. World War II created a centralization of power federally. The First Amendment, for example, was interpreted prior to World War II as not affecting the states. That the states could create laws overriding the US federal First Amendment, and there's nothing that the federal government could do with it. Post-World War II, with that incredible centralization of power in Washington, D.C. as a result of the war, the First Amendment overrode the states. So the US is a natural superpower, and it is always perceived at the geostrategic level, if there is a contiguous landmass which integrates, that can hold more people than the United States and have a greater GDP than the United States, and that's a threat. And that's been the view for more than 100 years, even prior to World War II. So this desire to prevent German and Russian integration, for example. And committed transatlanticists follow that vision, that the integration of the Eurasian continent is a threat, a long-term threat to the United States. China is integrating Eurasia from the east. It's not all the way over to Western Europe by any means. But yeah, I see that the technological factors actually do produce a natural integration of Eurasia, and that's I think a very healthy thing, because when people trade with each other and communicate with each other, and when language barriers are reduced, the chances of war are also decreased, and so policies and actions which divide people from integration increase the chance of war. And why you can talk about the integration decreases local sovereignty, and it often does, and means you have to make compromises, that the costs of war are so tremendous that perhaps the risks of integration should be taken. But despite that, in the UK case, I favour Brexit, because I think the UK is reducing continental integration. I think it's probably good, perhaps, for the UK to stay in, but I think it's bad for the EU for the UK to stay in. But as to what the future will be after this, just it's a signal, regardless of the result of a lack of political legitimacy of the EU institutions and of establishments, and that will be read at the national level in different European countries. It's a threat to the legitimacy of national establishments, and of course it will be read at the EU level as well, and that therefore creates a huge opportunity for people to say, well, here's how you get legitimacy, this way. You asked the question. You asked the question.
Yeah, that's the question. Do you think this will have a kind of domino effect?
But then, as that project continues, or not, we move in the other direction, there's massive other factors like Google DeepMind and the geometrically increasing ability of artificial intelligence, which is, we're not talking about killer robots running around. Actually, we are talking about killer robots running around, but we're not talking about wild killer robots running around. We're talking about killer robots run by companies rented out to the Pentagon and to other interests. But that can produce such a increase in capacity by the companies that can control them, such an increase in the ability to outmaneuver their rivals, that can really lead to quite an unpredictable situation for humanity. And people in Silicon Valley believe that's just fine. They all want to rush towards something that they religiously call the singularity, where you can't even predict 30 seconds ahead because computational power is moving so quickly. We have already uploaded all of our lives to the internet, so all the raw food for these artificial intelligences to learn from is there. And you've seen the time frames, that the time frames of political events come faster and faster. And it's quite hard to predict even 2 years ahead now. And these come faster and faster, and they think that's a great thing because they think that pretty soon Google and some other companies like it in Silicon Valley will have such computational power that it'll be able to simulate human beings and they can upload their brains into these computers and live forever, and they can instruct the computers to create a kind of group sex and drug nirvana, much like is promised under Islam. And these Silicon Valley engineers can eke out their existence there forever. And it gets all these engineers to work. I'm serious. They seriously believe this. And it means that they're able to employ smarter people for less money because they feed them this ideology that they're not simply working on a giant advertising company, which is Google, moving into the transport sector and the military drone sector, but rather it is a mechanism to achieve eternal life and eternal happiness for human beings. It is a religion for atheists. But they don't know the first thing about history or human psychology, which is whatever group has such a power to outpredict other groups will use it to gain dominance over them. It's the case for every single weapon that has been invented. Every single thing with computational edge so far in history has been used to do that. So that's potentially something very unpredictable with the consequences that are unpredictable for human beings, except it seems, based on history, they're likely to be bad because they give particular groups domination. And that can really push aside, to some degree, the questions about what is the future of Europe, because it's about what is the future of the world.
That's a good conclusion, I think. And I think we have a topic for another TV show, which should be technology. You should do these shows once a month, I think.
Okay, Edward Snowden has tweeted.
Really?
So, yeah.
He's woken up tomorrow morning.
Actually, I already saw this one. He tweeted 12 hours ago, but most people haven't picked it up. No matter the outcome, Brexit polls demonstrate how quickly half of any population can be convinced to vote against itself. Quite a lesson.
A slightly tangential thought, but not much. There's one big difference I noticed between the Scottish referendum campaign and the Brexit campaign, which is that the Scottish referendum campaign was very much driven in a way we all thought the new politics was going to work, that the entire corporate media was against Scottish independence without exception. And the Scottish pro-independence campaign was almost all new media. And it was a combination of new media and old politics.
Yeah.
It was new media.
That's a very interesting point. The BBC and the other big media companies were aggressively against Scottish independence.
Aggressively against, and unanimously so.
Although I have to say, in this vote, we're seeing Twitter and Facebook Facebook and Google have tried to influence the campaign on the Remain side. But because they're mostly distributors, or pretending to mostly be distributors rather than publishers of original content, Yeah, it's the average person that's using these things.
Exactly, but the Brexit campaign has much more relied on its support from sections of the billionaire and media, and hasn't actually been particularly savvy in its use of new media, which has been quite interesting.
I mean, there was so much momentum behind the Scottish independence campaign. It was a big positive case and something to be inspired by, and all the commonweal stuff. And there was a real momentum behind it. And I don't think that it has, the EU referendum has been anything like that. And I actually feel that, I mean, also the EU referendum is an extraordinarily negative.
Let me interrupt you.
I was getting somewhere. JP
Morgan has called it for leave, predicts with a 51.5% victory.
Really?
Now, JP Morgan often does this with elections.
Yeah, they're trying to move the markets and bet the other way.
Yeah,
that could be right. That could be right. That's a very interesting observation. Yeah, they probably know the result either way. Sorry, you were saying.
So, what I was saying, I think the contrast between the two referendums is very instructive. And yes, you're right, it's been sort of mainstream media and less popular enthusiasm here. But actually, in a way, if running a very negative campaign, what it does is it puts off people who are sort of in the middle or undecided. They just think this whole thing is horrible. I'm going to stay home and vote. And if, say, you're a pro-Brexit person or you're running a pro-Brexit campaign, you actually have an incentive to run as nasty a campaign as possible, because you want your people to come out who are already sold on the idea, and you want everyone else to stay at home and not bother. So I think there's some of that has happened here, and I just think such a contrast between those two campaigns.
We mentioned Chilcot inquiry, which is the huge, what's been going since 2007.
It's a long time.
At least.
9-year inquiry was meant to be completed in 1 year into the Iraq war in this country. That's due out on July 6th.
Yeah.
Someone's going to be the fall guy in that thing. It's interesting to think that Tony Blair is the natural one, but it's interesting to think whether they will go for him. Obviously, it's the biggest thing that Chilcot is going to do. I don't think he was a kind of safe pair of hands on some other inquiries.
Yeah, Butler inquiry.
Yeah, which makes you wonder what he is going to do with this one. On the other hand, it's going to be the big thing that he did in his life that he will be remembered for. We published a cable in 2009 with the UK Ministry of Defence Director General for Security Policy, goes into the US Embassy, and this is the report back from the ambassador, that he also promised that the UK had, this is in relation to Chilcot inquiry into Iraq war, quote, put measures in place to protect your interests during the UK inquiry into the causes of the Iraq war. So that's what does that mean in relation to Chilcot? It believes that, it seems to be implying that don't worry, Chilcot's not going to look into anything that is critical in relation to the United States. It's all going to be UK based.
There are a few things there. I think the Chilcot inquiry is going to spread the blame very thinly and widely. So it's going to say, yes, Tony Blair maybe, accidentally got the assessment wrong of intelligence, but it wasn't quite meant. It was a structural problem, the way it was fed through. And then, and the military didn't prepare properly for the invasion, and this wasn't presented properly. And it'll blame lots of people, but not very much. And that'll be the technique. It's not going to hone in and say, it's not going to be forensic and say, Blair agreed with Bush a year in advance to go to war when they met at Crawford Ranch. The evidence was totally fixed, and there are minutes, and there was evidence given to say that the evidence was being fixed in order to present a false representation to the public. It's not going to say that. Gordon Brown handpicked personally the members of the Chilcot inquiry. There were 5 people on the team originally. 2 of whom I know reasonably well. All of them, except for Baroness Tadash, I think her name is, all the others were on record as supporting the war in Iraq. Martin Gilbert, one of the original members, who actually died 3/4 it's been going on so long, the members have been dying, but Martin Gilbert, one of the members, actually wrote an article in which he said that because of the war in Iraq, Tony Blair and George Bush would be remembered in the same way we remember Roosevelt and Churchill. And he's a member of the Inquiry.
Yeah.
And there's another guy in the Inquiry whose name I forget, but who was the originator in many ways of the academic theory of liberal intervention. Lawrence Steedman, I think his name. And who...
I'll interrupt you, Craig. ITV News is predicting Brexit 75% likely.
No, they're all wrong. But one of the other members he came to fame from being a supporter of interventionist wars abroad. And when you consider that, and Roderick Lyne, who I know, who was ambassador in Russia while I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, he was actively involved in the preparations for the war. And he's one of the people who should be under investigation, and not one of the people who should be investigating. It's a total fix. And I mean, why go for Roderick Lyne? The vast majority of retired senior diplomats were against the war and were on record as being against the war. The vast majority of retired senior military people were against the war.
Okay, and you could have picked amongst any of those. Even if you had randomly picked them, you
even if you'd only had one of the five who was against the war. But in fact, every member who's recorded as having an opinion was recorded as being for the war strongly.
But that might not be that that they're actually for the war. That means the UK state establishment wanted the war, and there are those people who understand that it is their job to do what the state wants, and therefore they're a safe pair of hands in relation to Chilcot inquiry, not necessarily in a particular direction, but just they will do what is wanted.
Chilcot himself comes in that category. But I think 3 of the members of the inquiry aren't in that category. They're genuine hawks who were properly in favour of the war. So I think...
So you're not optimistic at all in the...
Not at all. And I think actually there's been a deliberate amount of theatricality. The leaving it so long, taking so long, has been designed to give the idea that it's definitive and fair. If you see what I mean. Whereas it isn't at all. It'll be a total whitewash.
Vince Cable, that's a Liberal Democrat MP. Ex-MP?
Yeah.
Okay. Has said it looks like the UK has narrowly voted to leave the European Union, or at best...
None of these people know
away
anything.
from the majority. So, yeah, they don't know.
No. We will see.
Fingers crossed.
Freco, let's get back to future of the European Union. Even though Chilcot is kind of interesting because it's in some ways, I mean, the Iraq War really is I think it is the greatest tragedy of the modern West.
Yeah,
it is the end of, well, it was never innocent, frankly, but it was the end of the illusion. Of innocence of the post-Cold War left. Sorry, of the post-Cold War West.
And today's European leadership wouldn't stand against it in the way that the then European leadership stood against Bush. I mean, because one of the good things was, if you remember, France and Germany stood
That's right.
against it. That wouldn't happen.
And Hollande. We've seen an example, Libya.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we've seen too, Libya and Syria. And both have been intensely involved.
Yeah.
Freco, future European Union?
I'm dying because I'm so tired. But you know why I'm tired?
You were meant to be here. You were meant to be here hours and hours.
I was meant to be here.
So tell the audience your excuse.
Yeah, why didn't I come?
Why haven't you
before?
been drinking whiskey?
Someone has to do it. The diplomats, come on. No, I'm so tired already that if I would have one glass of whiskey, I would just collapse. But I was supposed to be here at the beginning at 8, and I didn't come because I took a flight from Ljubljana, actually. And I was stuck at the airport for 6 hours. Why? Speaking about the future of Europe, because of the strike of air traffic controllers in France. And you know what is happening in France today? I think that's the future of Europe. So first what they did with Greece is experimenting with labor reforms with the pigs, Portugal, Spain, Ireland and so on. And it's a kind of colonization of the periphery of the European Union. Mm-hmm. So there it functions or it doesn't function. It depends on the perspective which you choose. So now let's import it into France. So what I would say, what's happening in Europe today, in the European Union, first you had a process of colonization through austerity measures, new privatization.
I just want to.
And now you have just to
hang on,
finish it.
I just want to.
It's impossible with you.
I want to pump up Ecuador for a moment because they deserve some credit for allowing this to happen. A lot of credit, actually. I mean, not allowing Brexit to happen, but allowing me to broadcast from this embassy. And not that they're behind, they don't care one way or the other, but just it's rights of their refugee. Where am I going with this? Yes, debt. The UK has 80% debt to GDP. What that means is that the amount of debt of the UK is equal to its entire economic output for almost a year, 80% of a year. France is about 100% debt to GDP. To pay off its debts, France would have to take all its economic output, not spend it on anything else, including not just basic services, but buying food, and instead pay it to debt. Spain is 120% debt to GDP. Ecuador is 30% debt to GDP. So really, Europe is a heavily fiscalized society by debt arrangements. But I interrupted an important point that Shreko was trying to get to.
The important point is precisely this, that you had colonization even by indebtment in Greece, for instance, which has how much? 160, is it more % of the GDP? I don't know. But now what you have, and precisely the reason why I'm late today to the show, is you have a process of auto-colonization of Europe. That what was functioning as a colonization process on the periphery, now it's happening in the center of the European Union. And that's the reason why I think it's collapsing, you know. If it's possible in France to get rid of the labor laws which existed before, then of course it's possible in Greece and in Spain and so on. And I think now it's coming back as a boomerang. The same as the refugee crisis came back, the same as terrorism came back, now austerity measures are happening inside of the heart of the European Union. And it's not sustainable.
There's a healthy resistance in France.
In France with Nuit debout, but also mainly with the general strike, I think. That's really huge.
Well, unions are still strong in France. Yeah. But I mean, they do go through this process basically every 2 years of quite strong strikes and then protest movements, and they get concessions. And that's a very natural political dynamic in France.
And people are late in the show because of them, which is not fair. Which is not fair at all.
You can't blame them, Shreko. Okay, guys, I think we should wrap up because the crew is getting really tired. It's 3:30 a.m. I think I am likely to call it for Brexit because I think JP Morgan has those analytical skills. I like very much Craig's idea that they're pushing the market to bet the other way. But I think they probably have too much... Okay, we probably have... There's the current vote count. That's quite a lot of votes with just over half the... just under half of the areas reporting, 48.6% Remain, 51.4% Brexit. So I think I would call it at about 80% chance for Brexit. I think probably JP Morgan has spent a lot of money analysing it for the markets, and they have a lot of reputation to lose.
I may have to go home and declare Scottish independence in the morning.
Yes, you might. You might.
Which is great. I think if it is a Brexit, I don't think people should underestimate the strength of the Scottish independence campaign that's coming.
Keep talking, Shreko. I need to find a piece of paper.
Yeah, no, it's. I don't think Nicola Sturgeon can get out of the promise for a second independent referendum in the event of a Brexit. I'm not confident she wouldn't get out of it if she could, but I don't think she can. I think we will have a second independent referendum now. I'm very confident that we will go for independence. So every cloud has a silver lining. I'm not going to be leaving the EU.
Are you trying to find some leaks or something?
I'm trying to find our guest list, which is written down on a piece of paper in handwriting and is not here.
Are you wanting to thank everybody?
Yes, I wanted to thank everybody.
Let's try to remember.
Let's try and remember. Okay, so I'd like to thank Ecuador for permitting me to host this thing. We actually have a really big crew, and we took up half the embassy foyer, and it was quite an inconvenience for the staff here. But as well as them, the crew, the guests. Okay,
list.
Great. We have a list. The recordings will be out tomorrow. You can look on brexitclub.eu for them. We'll try and perhaps clip some of the better moments. I'd like to thank our guests, Ashton Ratunzi, MIA. I don't know what happened to you. You're a great friend, but you didn't turn up. Very bad. You're meant to be here from 8. What's going on? Vivian Westwood, who gave a really strong speech for Remain, which I agree with in principle, actually. I think in practice, maybe not. Shreko Horvat, David Graeber, Professor of Anthropology at the LSE, Cenk Uygur from the United States, Ben Griffin, former soldier and effective head of Veterans for Peace, Pablo Bustanby, the Foreign Affairs spokesperson for Podemos. Very interesting to see their opinion immediately ahead of the Spanish election. Christophe Marchand, human rights lawyer from Brussels. Charlie Skelton, actually probably one of the most interesting guests, who's writing a book on Bilderberg, not a conspiracy book, but a practical book about what that organisation is about. I met 2 weeks ago, etc. Where are we? Charlie Skelton, Craig Murray, former British ambassador and Scotsman, going home tomorrow, it seems, to declare Scottish independence. Johannes Wallström, investigative journalist from Sweden. Vaughan Smith, founder of the Frontline Club in London for journalists, former war reporter and officer in the Grenadier Guards. Naomi Colvin, director of the Courage Foundation in London. Cody Wilson, philosopher from Texas. Yanis Varoufakis, calling in from Rome, former economic minister for Greece, who famously stood off with Schroeder and Germany in negotiation of the Greek crisis. And of course, Embassy Cat and Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks in the United States. Okay, and also to you, the audience, please try and tweet out and share on Facebook and etc. Weibo, VK, other social networks, this thing. Also to Associated Press, who have taken the feed, Russia Today, who have taken the feed, and a bunch of others who have taken the feed. Thanks and good night. We done? Yeah.